but here, so one of the things I've seen, and I've seen it happen with people who I've talked to who used to live in the city and now live in the country because of issues they had in the city that made them feel unsafe and they left. Um, the longer they lived out of the city, the more pro individualism they were, and the more pro self sustainability they were. Meaning, you should know how to hunt, or you should know how to farm, or you should know how to do these things. Because since they now live out of town, it's better to, oh, I can grow some of my own lettuce and stuff and not have to go into the city. This is better for me. And now that I think about it, it's something good everyone should know. What happens is, rural people tend to be much more individualist, much more, about self-sustainability and doing things on your own and being able to understand how to do things, which aligns with what is considered a masculine mentality of self-sufficiency is usually a thing that the expectation of is associated with masculinity, although it's not required to be, because women can absolutely be self-sustainable.
People are people.
So what should it be? But these kind of go along with one another and get lumped in with claims I don't want to talk about because it gets into territory where I don't want people to get mad because it's easy to misconstrue what I'm saying. But because you have people who are more pro-individualist and more pro-self-sufficiency, both of these are mindsets that typically align with what is traditional libertarianism and things like this, which tends to fall under, election-wise, because of how our politics works, what is a Republican standpoint, meaning that they tend to lean more to the right. Even though it's not that simple, politics is not a bar, it's like a multi-dimensional graph. There's a lot of things that can affect how a political opinion is formed. But rural places have to be more self-sufficient. For example, based on your internet. A person who lives out of town, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, why don't you just look it up online or stuff when you hear, say, they're out in the countryside? And the only news I can get is from the 3 major cable networks.
I mean, the advent of the smartphone helps.
Yes, the advent of the smartphone. And it can. Although there are still, especially in, say, like Wyoming or parts of Alaska or places like that,
dead zones,
there is no way that it's financially feasible for a company to put a tower out where you need for some people. So they're just without. They won't even have a smartphone. Their town might have one telephone. I've heard of places where that's the case. There's a public phone at the bar or the church or whatever. That's the phone for the city because it's too expensive to run a bunch of lines out there. So you have this expectation of self-sufficiency because, as with this, if you live far enough out of town, if a place is even willing, which they may not be, to install an internet line out to you if you live, say, 10 miles out of town.
And they're not wrong for not doing it.
Of course not. Every, say, 1,000 feet of wire that they put, it'll just hike up the cost of that even more and even more. And so if you live way out of town, you might have dial-up. Like he literally still has dial-up.
No, I don't.
Oh, that's right.
It's not supported anymore.
That's right. They got rid of dial-up.
All I have is my phone.
Yeah, until like 2018, he literally had dial-up.
I didn't use it because it doesn't work.
It was awful. It was.
Right,
it was
modern internet stuff
don't
isn't
function with dial-up.
Well, sites aren't built as a burden that dial-up can handle. Modern.
Yeah. So HTML5 has a lot of cool benefits, but with dial-up,
it doesn't work.
It doesn't function because there's too much running in the background. And too much that's having to update all the time, and something as slow as dial-up just can't keep up.
What?
Twitchy tree.
What you doing?
But and so you'll have out of town people who they might have cable, and there are probably places that don't even have cable. And I actually do remember that this was a controversy with, I think it was my grandpa, someone where when they switched from analog to digital, it was a huge issue because if they lived so far out of town, having the bunny ears so you could watch your 2 or 3 channels or whatever until they came up with the digital antenna was a huge issue because it meant that they had, at that point, it was probably years after they bought it, but when they first bought it, it would have been like $500 TV. That now just sat in their house because they couldn't do anything with it. So I think what they ended up doing with it mostly was their wife, when they were home and not at the office, would watch VHS and then later DVD on it. And,
God damn it.
why are the radioactive here?
Oh, it's the weather, I think, just changed.
Oh.
There's a flash.
And so, but what happens is you'll have people who come from a completely urban experience. And this is, I think, a problem that a lot of political discussions ignore, is this split between urban and rural as opposed to left and right, or pro this or against this kind of thing, is the idea that part of it has to do with location demographics, and that's ignored. And Aiden's looking.
Ha! Yummy.
The
Master.
The urban rural gap, I think, is where a lot of these decisions in United States politics are made, because of the fact that since this is such a physically large place, you have a lot of rural centers and a lot of urban centers that have formed and get niche, and they get agreements. And when you have things like the internet, what happens is all the people who are on the internet are mostly from urban centers, because, as I said, rural people don't have as much access to the internet. First,
I've literally spent hours and hours and hours just sitting at Burger King because it's internet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I haven't done that last year or so for some reason, but you know.
Yeah, no, he would play games on the computer on his laptop that he would bring to a restaurant because he didn't have internet.
Especially pre-smartphone.
And but so what ends up happening is then you have a feedback loop come from large urban centers talking with other large urban centers
So it
about
becomes
what
an echo
they
chamber?
yes, about what they agree with, which is the same as what they agree with. So obviously this is the right idea because everyone who I've talked to agrees about this. And what happens is all of the people who live outside of that in non-urban centers, one, they don't hear those arguments. Two, they might have arguments of their own. Three, the arguments they have might be based on their experience, which the people who live in a city center wouldn't experience, i.e. the combines, an electric combine if it existed, transportation laws changing, the way subsidies function, and how city centers get certain benefits that wouldn't affect anyone outside of the city, but those people outside the city still have to pay for. A lot of times what you'll see also is in college towns, what will happen is college towns have a revolving door of residents because people come from out of town to go to college. And so what happens is a lot of decisions will be made by the college, which in college towns tends to be a large part of the population, making decisions about the city that they don't plan to live in, and then they leave. And they'll make decisions that can be
it's just bones.
that can be outright destructive to the people who live in the town, from things like homeowners pay this tax to fund this thing, and the decision will be made that it's only funded by homeowners, meaning that all of the apartment owning college students don't pay for it. And then they'll make these philanthropic things that the benefit makes sense, but the way that it's approached and the cost that comes with it only hurts the people who live there, giving animosity from the people who live there towards the people who don't or who won't and are just there residing temporarily.
And these kinds of animosity just
and
it fuels the cycle, I'd imagine.
Yes. And so it's a smaller example of what I'm talking about with the urban rural. And it's easier to explain because you have these two demographics that are very clear and easy to explain in example from the same city's policies, which city policies is where a lot of those decisions will come up. But with urban and rural, what will end up happening is the rural people will then have to deal with the brunt of what happens because the internet is essentially the megalopolis, and everyone who lives outside of it is not privy to those information. And if they disagree with the megalopolis, you get the consequences, which in modern times now gets to be people telling people their address and having people go and harass them, and other brigading and these kinds of completely unacceptable tactics that I wouldn't care what your opinion was. It doesn't mean that you can go and harass the person's wife and children, that or
Oh, of course
husband
not.
and children, or grandparents, or their boss, or thing like it's disgusting. And that again is a technique that will only be engaged in by the internet side of things because it's an internet provided thing where you have a communication device that sends to other people. You wouldn't see it the other way. One, because a lot of people who are pro self sufficiency don't want you messing with them, and they want to be left alone, and so they wouldn't really encourage that kind of technique.
They also can't.
But also, yes, it's not a mechanism they could engage in if they wanted to.
Yeah,
And
I guess he doesn't mind if I don't hit him.
and so the what ends up happening is you have a pile on of what is an unacceptable action being encouraged by a group of people who aren't thinking in the long term about what their actions do and what those consequences are. Because traditionally, along with it, the people who are going to agree with what the hell is that?
He was having fun.
What will end up happening is the
Oh, baby rattle. What?
the same the same political alignments also happen based on the age demographics because again older people tend to live farther from the city
And are also
because,
less technologically savvy,
yes,
typically.
yes,
It's just, well, I imagine it's a fact.
I mean it is because it gets harder and harder to use new
Technology.
things as you get older because your brain's not able to develop synapses and learn new processes. That's why you have the I have to show my grandpa how to use the internet jokes so much.
All the time. Because, well, it happens.
Yes. And so, but the other thing is, older people tend to live farther from the city because as you get older, you don't want to be around the hustle and bustle. You don't want to be around the louder noises. You want to be in a place that doesn't have as high demands. You don't want to be in a place where you're dealing with traffic all the time, things like that.
I don't like looks of this place.
You want to, you know, live a more peaceful existence the older you get. Although, again, there's the malicious side of things where you have your ignorant people who do just decide that they're going to do this or that, and living out of town makes that easier. And so you do have your, ignorant people who also move out of the town.
Oh,
But, so older people tend to live outside of town, or they live in, at the very least, outskirts of suburban areas where they can still get to a marketplace or whatever that's easier, where you're not going to have it in a smaller town. Um, but with that, it also means that you have in cities younger people who also tend to traditionally politically align with what seems like the longer term benefits of things that you see on the farther left, which aren't always as accurate in further research, but generally tends to be more beneficial on the whole to a larger society from that standpoint of being in the city. And so you'll have politically left leaning people, mostly in the cities, are also younger people. Well, especially with the people coming into where they're politically aware, usually around age 13 onward to about age 25, where you start to try and learn what is ethical versus what is politically correct and what is an acceptable breach of what might be ethics. Like when you're saying make other people pay for this person in the case of the bus law or whatever. And especially when you have, like, in a college town where not only do you have the disconnect of the older people who live in the town versus the people who are visiting to go to college and then leaving, where they don't have the consequences of what falls on them. They tend to be even more what is the dictionary definition of liberal in the sense of like carefree liberal, whereas like the more liberal in spending, more willing to be a person spending, because they're not the ones having to pay for it. It's worse in college towns. That's why you'll tend to see college towns tend to have more radical decisions. Not always. There are some places where that's not the case, and it's definitely never true of 100% of places all the time. Um, Liberal strongholds with younger people. The I derailed myself.
Oh, this is how you made the buttercups, I think.
Oh,
Sorry, I just...
the original guy,
I think, yeah, there's...
the giddy
I'm
up.
focused here a bit.
Um,
Oh,
oh, was that the last message he got from her?
Yeah, he was like 200 something years ago. Maybe it was about it. What are you doing, Codsworth? Quit pushing him. Codsworth!
Okay.
Do you need something?
But what ends up happening is, part of that is, and there's nothing wrong with it, because I don't think either side is 100% correct. That's what I really come down. The biggest thing I think is that people need to care about people. That's
I think people need to try more to understand
the other
others.
side. Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
There is danger
barring
in
the
that.
worst exceptions. Barring, like, I don't want to have to understand the KKK. I don't want to have to understand any extremist group where it's clear from any kind of functional societal standpoint that it's a malicious, destructive mindset. I don't want to have to understand, for example, Scientology.
I sure don't understand.
Those far extremes, I think that they need to at least be heard. And part of that is because, and this is why I'm a pretty strong advocate of free speech, especially for people who are comfortable enough at being that free speaker, is I think that the craziest ideas need to be heard, because when people can then see that they're wrong and they can address it, that's when you can try and change people's minds away from those dangerous decisions. Whereas, if free speech is not permitted, those thoughts fester underground and are only communicated within each other until it becomes dangerous when you get something like the Westboro Baptist Church, where you have adults speaking to other adults in a isolated community that does not agree with anyone else.
Echo chamber.
And then they teach their kids who don't have any way of experiencing the outside world to understand what's wrong with that mindset.
Unless that's all they ever hear,
yes,
that's probably what they'll go with.
And so I think that they need to be able to speak freely, because there are numerous members of the Westboro Baptist Church that have defected. They've left and they think it's horrible and don't want to associate with their own family, because mostly it's one family. And they're an example of where this problem comes in, is the echo chamber of now this large megalopolis of the internet. Is you have a bunch of kids coming into their own understanding of politics in a society that's now swept towards this more urban focused mindset and ignores the issues outside of town. But even if you have people from outside of town who grew up in these situations, they're still being taught, if they get the internet, the mindset of the other people. But the people outside of town can't communicate their issues to the people in town as easily. And you'll have an entire generation, as it gets more and more into this internet mindset that's mostly urban and mostly leans towards urban benefits, pushing more to help the people in the cities without thinking of the consequences on the people out of the cities because of the lack of communication. And those younger people are all thinking this is the only correct mindset because it's all they read. They'll read 100% of articles come from this side that thinks in the city, because they're the ones who have the either only internet or the better internet, and therefore can spend 6 hours on Twitter.
And of course, humans have an evolutionary desire to fit in with the masses, because once upon a time, that's how you survive.
Yes, and so what ends up happening is you'll have this younger generation now of kids who are coming from out of town, riding the bus into the city where all their friends who live in the city, and all their parents who think the way that the people in the city think, and all the people on the internet the way they think, all agrees with the people in the city because the city's where all of the internet is and all of those kinds of things. Are you taking it to her? Like her grave or something?
No, he's giving us... Oh.
Hey! And that's the end of that?
Apparently. It seems to have like a unique quest road that doesn't seem to do anything.
Although it's a cute one, and I definitely want to put it at
We'll put it in the
houses.
box.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about putting it in the box. Like, I think maybe put it on some sort of shelf at the castle or something.
Alright. Hard to fit on someone's head,
but and so what'll end up happening is it will further and further forsake the urban or the rural people because it benefits urban, and urban has kind of that authoritative benefit over the rural because as more people live in the city than out of the city. It's just
that's how cities work.
It's pragmatic. More people want to live where the resources are, and less people want to live where they have to be self-sustainable. And self-sustainability, again, goes with the right-wing, as it were, mindset. People who are out of town encourage self-sustainability because that's what they've had to live with. And people who think self-sustainably tend to be more individualist and tend to be more interested in being left alone and paying for themselves and dealing with themselves and not wanting to shoulder the burden of other people. They might be a little bit less altruistic in the mindset of it doesn't benefit them or whatever because they don't see any of that, and they've seen people treat them badly, as I said, assuming they hate people for their decisions or whatever. But their kids are now going to be taught that the mindset that lets them fit in is the one that goes against, say, how their parents are. And especially because you have a lot of traditional families tend to be more like religious, for example. You'll have people who say they live in a town where this is unrealistic, but say they live in their family is traditional Christian, but not anti-gay or whatever. But like they're staunchly, we pray every night and we go to church every Sunday, whatever, things like that. But then they go to a town because the only school nearby is the one in X city. And the one in X city is, say, well, religion is old world, and we don't do religion here, and we think religion is foolish. And so there's whatever in the town, you'll see a lot of people and their kids making fun of, oh, well, they believe in God, isn't that cute, and whatever. And over time, the kid will become non-religious. And you've actually experienced part of this last part, where as they become non-religious, it hurts their parents. Because their parent, how your mom doesn't like it that you don't go to church.
Right, and but at the same time, if I go just for her, that's not what she wants either.
No.
I don't know how to give her what she wants.
Exactly. And so what ends up happening is in this extreme, unreal situation, because in every town there's going to be religion. Because religion is a very historic thing, and it has a lot of benefits. And I don't oppose people being religious, even if I'm not, because I think that there's a lot of good that can come from it. There just also happens to be plenty of bad things, i.e. Scientology, for example. But what ends up happening in this situation with this hypothetical kid in this very ideal, unique, specific situation that is obviously unrealistic as it is, but as an example for this discussion, they're slowly pushed away from religion to the point where they're embarrassed by their parents because their parents believe in God, and everyone they've ever met thinks that it's foolish to believe in God, and that say all people who are religious hate all people who aren't religious, or whatever, trumped up, ridiculous assumption that they make in this example. And so what ends up happening is then you have this schism within the family. And then you have,
where do you get all these Molotovs?
I don't know. You'll have this child who's rebellious to their parents, and they do things, say, that they don't even believe in because they fit in. And this is where you get a little bit of touchy subject stuff that I'm going to skip over because it can get really bad.
Because it's touchy.
But what ends up happening is, say, then they come out one day that I am a staunch atheist, and maybe they're not in their heart of hearts, they actually still believe in God, and
maybe they don't know what they believe.
Well, that too, that can be a real possibility too. But say in their heart of hearts they still believe, oh, for example, if I can't think of a good example, because like I said, in this hypothetical situation, to make it easier, there's no anti-gay mindset, for example, which is usually a big sticking point in particularly religious families. Yeah. But say, okay, for example, they're a completely accepting group, except in the Bible it does say you're not supposed to wear clothes of two different materials. This is a real thing that's actually in the Bible. You're not supposed to wear, say...
Old Testament's got some weird stuff.
You're not supposed to wear, say, wool and cotton together. And so... And this happens to be in this weird situation because I'm trying to make it as multi-accessible as possible without being offensive to anybody. This kid comes home, say, in a leather jacket that they bought and jeans and whatever, and it upsets the parents. They get in a fight and they never talk to each other for 10 years or whatever over this jean jacket or whatever. I mean, like I said, this is a silly example to try and get across the point. Where what happens is they get in a big argument and they never talk with their family again. And one thing I can tell you, say they run away at 16 is what ends up happening for this.
Oh.
While not everyone is given the...
Wow, that fire hurts, actually.
While not everyone who experiences life gets to have the fortune of having a complete family. 2 parents, for example, or maybe 2 parents and a grandparent, or whatever, some situation where they're with a cohesive situation where they have more than one person to go to with their problems, and more than one person to develop their understanding of what is right and wrong. And whatever things that come from not having only one mindset that you're learning from, which is fairly important. I don't think that it's realistic to assume, I think it's actually very ignorant to assume, that the 2 parents have to be, say, a mother and a father. I think that you can develop, say, if you're needing a male role model from a friend, a friend's parents, whatever, or a female role model and a parent, or a friend, a friend's parent, teachers in all these cases, whatever. I mean, I would say one of my, probably not my best role model because I do get along with my family, but
toasty.
I do have some scout leaders who were very strong male role models to me. I mean, very important in my development and things like that. So I don't think that they have to be a male and a female. I think that assumption is outdated. Jesus, how many people are there? You just broke both arms.
From fire.
But I do
stop?
think it's important for people to have at least 2 homebodies as much as possible to try and form the ability. Because what ends up happening is if you're in, especially in a single parent household, which does happen, and I don't think that
you're exposed to fewer mindsets.
Well, not only that, but one, you do get where you have one authoritative "this is right" mindset from the one parent, and I don't think someone should be ashamed if they're a child to one parent or whatever. I don't think that's something to be ashamed of, because especially it's not even your fault. Yeah, it's not something you can control. But the other big problem that happens is, one, if you have an argument, you don't have anyone who can try and be the neutral party to understand it if there's an argument. And I've had plenty of times where, say, I've gotten in an argument with my dad, and my mom was like, well, did you think about it from this way or whatever? And made me understand that it wasn't as clear-cut as I thought it was.
Eye washers?
Yes.
Cool.
But then the other thing that you have is, especially when you get to your more rebellious ages, or your ages where you're going to start experimenting with what experiences you think are important in, say, religion. or a relationship or anything like that is you tend to shy away from whoever you see as probably your most authoritative parental figure, and you might want to trust someone else. And having someone who you can talk to anytime at your house makes it a lot easier than if you have to wait until your next scout meeting, for example, or bowling where your coach is, or whatever situation. Especially now that phones are a different way than they used to be, where you could have one at your house or whatever. If you live out in the countryside and you have a cell phone that has no signal, then you can't communicate with people until the next time you see them, maybe. Gotcha. Having two parents makes it so that you can have a second person you can go to if you think the other one, for example, might get too mad.
I mean, yeah. I think we've all been there.
Yeah. And so, like, there's a lot of times where I've gone to dad because there were things I thought would upset mom, or I've gone to mom because there were things I thought would upset dad. Having that second person to talk to makes it so that you can feel more comfortable
talking
asking someone who you're going to see on a daily basis, so you don't have to bottle something up and make it an anxiety problem or any other number of issues. And so, say that this kid ran away because they didn't get along with their parents over this leather jacket jeans situation, because I couldn't come up with anything that would be...
And you didn't want to get too real.
Yeah, I didn't want it to be a situation... That didn't even fit in that box. I didn't want it to be some sort of situation like I was saying with LGBT, for example, where you could get into something where it would make a touchy assumption as an extension of it, but if it's just the jean jacket and whatever, there's no baggage that comes with the idea. There's no, like...
It's not a very real situation.
Well, not only that, but so, like... I grew up... So I am pan. I'm not straight. And I was okay coming out to my parents because my parents are pretty non-judgmental. I'm not going to even
test if that hurts.
My parents are very non-judgmental, and they're fine with me being who I want to be. And so I had a lucky situation where it didn't matter much to me. As a result of being in a situation where it's been very accepting, I don't really associate my sexuality or my gender identities
as a problem
with... Well, no, what ends up happening is, especially in places where people haven't been able to be themselves, they develop it as a strong aspect of their identity as a person. You'll see a lot of people, for example, who will say, I'm pan, and that's central to my identity.
Which is unhealthy?
It can be unhealthy. I'm not saying that it's a completely unacceptable thing. Some people, maybe that is, you know, especially if you're a rights activist or whatever, and it is central to you developing your personality, it can be meaningful. And I don't think that it doesn't have to be. But as a person who didn't, most of the people I've met do make it